January 30th, 1943. In a radio message sent to a basement bunker in a dying city on the Volga River, Adolf Hitler informs General Friedrich Paulus that he has just been promoted to Field Marshal, the highest active rank in the German military. It sounds like an honor. It is not. Hitler knows something specific about German military history. No German Field Marshal has ever surrendered or been taken prisoner alive. By handing Paulus this promotion in the final hours of a catastrophic defeat, Hitler is sending a message without saying it out loud: take your own life, or become the first man in your nation's history to break that record in the worst possible way. Paulus reads the message. Then he does something Hitler never expected. He picks up the surrender terms instead. This is the story of the general who was handed a death sentence disguised as an honor, and chose to live, even though living meant becoming one of the most hated men in Nazi Germany, a prisoner of the enemy for a decade, and eventually a witness against the very regime he had served. To understand why Friedrich Paulus ended up in that Stalingrad basement facing an impossible choice, you first need to understand what kind of officer he was. Because Paulus was, in almost every respect, the product of a system built to produce men who did not question orders. And that same training would eventually put him in a position no amount of obedience could have prepared him for. Paulus was born on September 23, 1890, in Cuxhaven, in the German province of Hesse. The son of a prison treasurer, solidly middle class, unremarkable, ambitious in the quiet way that produces career bureaucrats rather than dramatic historical figures. As a young man, he initially tried to enlist in the German Imperial Navy, an ambition that failed for reasons that remain unclear in the historical record. And he studied law briefly at the University of Marburg before abandoning that path and joining the army instead in February 1910. When the First World War began 4 years later, Paulus fought competently and without particular distinction, serving across multiple fronts: France, Macedonia, Romania, Serbia, ending the war as a captain, a solid but unspectacular record for an officer of his generation. The years between the wars are where Paulus's specific character becomes clear, and it is not the character of a battlefield commander. He was, by every account from colleagues and superiors, an exceptional staff officer, meticulous, disciplined, skilled at logistics and planning, the kind of officer other generals wanted managing the details of a campaign rather than leading troops in the field himself. This distinction matters enormously for what happened later. By 1940, Paulus had risen to become Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, and in this capacity, he was one of the key planners behind Operation Barbarossa, the catastrophic 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union that this channel has covered in detail. The invasion built on the racial fantasy that the Soviet Union would collapse the moment German forces crossed the border. Paulus helped design that plan. He was, in other words, present at the creation of the very ideological miscalculation that would eventually consume his own career. In January 1942, in the aftermath of Barbarossa's failure outside Moscow, Paulus was given his first significant field command, the Sixth Army, deployed to the Eastern Front. This was, by the standards of the German officer corps, an unusual promotion. Paulus was a planner being asked to become a battlefield commander, a desk officer suddenly responsible for the lives of hundreds of thousands of men in active combat, and this mismatch between his training and his new responsibility would matter enormously in the months that followed. Initially, the Sixth Army's advance went well. Under Paulus's command, German forces captured Kharkov in May 1942 as part of the broader summer offensive aimed at the Caucasus oil fields, and by August, the Sixth Army had turned toward a secondary objective on the Volga River, a city that carried the name of Germany's ideological enemy, Stalingrad. What followed has been covered extensively. The brutal building-by-building combat that neutralized every advantage German mechanized warfare had previously enjoyed. The Soviet encirclement in November 1942 that trapped 250,000 Axis soldiers, and the failed relief operation that came within 30 miles of the pocket before being forced to turn back. What matters specifically for Paulus's story is what kind of officer was making decisions inside that pocket during those catastrophic final weeks. Paulus was, by his fundamental character, a man trained his entire career to follow the chain of command precisely and without deviation. When his subordinate commanders urged him to attempt a breakout in the days immediately after the encirclement, when such a breakout still had a realistic chance of saving a significant portion of his army, Paulus deferred to Hitler's explicit prohibition rather than exercising independent judgment. This was not cowardice in any simple sense. It was the logical, catastrophic endpoint of exactly the kind of officer the German military system had spent 30 years training him to be. A man who improvised under pressure, who trusted his own judgment over orders from above, would likely have attempted the breakout regardless of what Berlin said. Paulus was not that man, and that is precisely why Hitler chose him, without fully understanding the choice he was making, to be the general who would face the most consequential moral decision of the entire war. By January 1943, the situation inside the Stalingrad pocket had moved beyond any reasonable definition of a fighting force. Soviet forces had captured the pocket's remaining airfields, cutting off even the inadequate airlift that Hermann Göring had promised could sustain the trapped army through the winter. Soldiers were dying from starvation and frostbite at rates that in many units exceeded combat casualties. Ammunition had been rationed down to a handful of shells per gun per day. On January 8, Soviet commanders had sent Paulus a formal surrender ultimatum with remarkably generous terms by Eastern Front standards: medical treatment, adequate food, safety for surrendering troops. Paulus forwarded the request to Hitler, as his training and temperament demanded. Hitler rejected it, ordering the Sixth Army to fight to the last man and the last round. The ultimatum was offered again in the following weeks as Soviet forces pressed deeper into the shrinking pocket. Hitler rejected it again, each time. By late January, with organized German resistance collapsing into isolated pockets and Soviet troops closing in on Paulus's own headquarters, the basement of a ruined department store in central Stalingrad, the outcome was no longer in question. What remained in question was only how the end would be recorded in history, and this is where Hitler made his final calculated move regarding the general he had placed in this position. On January 30, 1943, Hitler radioed Paulus his promotion to General Field Marshal. Field Marshal, the highest active military rank in Germany. The calculation behind this promotion has been confirmed by multiple historians examining the private communications from this period, and it was explicit rather than subtle. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive in the entire history of the German military. A fact of institutional pride that Hitler expected would compel Paulus to take his own life rather than become the first man to break that precedent while a prisoner of the enemy. Hitler was not offering Paulus an honor. He was offering him a script, a specific, well-understood role that German military culture had rehearsed for generations, in which a defeated commander who could not achieve victory was expected to preserve the honor of his rank through suicide, following essentially the same logic that had governed the deaths of Prussian and German officers facing capture for over a century. Paulus received this message inside the same ruined basement where he had spent the preceding weeks watching his army disintegrate. He did not comply with what Hitler expected. What Paulus actually said in the moments following his surrender reveals something that most accounts of Stalingrad simplify or omit entirely. This was not merely a practical decision to save his own life, but an act carrying real personal risk and, by his own account, a specific moral and religious dimension. Paulus was a devout Catholic, and Catholic doctrine at the time treated suicide as a mortal sin, a position that several historians have identified as a genuine factor in his decision, alongside the more obvious instinct for self-preservation. According to multiple historical accounts, Paulus responded to the entire situation with a statement expressing open contempt for the man who had placed him there, reportedly remarking that he had no intention of shooting himself for what he called this Bohemian corporal, a deliberately cutting reference to Hitler's Austrian origins and his relatively low rank during the First World War. Weaponized as an insult from a career Prussian-trained officer who had spent months watching his men die for a war effort Hitler had personally mismanaged. On January 31, 1943, less than 24 hours after receiving his marshal's baton, Friedrich Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces, reportedly identifying himself with almost bureaucratic formality. Field Marshal of the German Army Paulus renders himself prisoner to the Red Army, and apologizing, according to some accounts, that he had not yet received the appropriate uniform insignia for his newly promoted rank. He became the first German Field Marshal in the nation's history taken prisoner alive. 22 additional German generals surrendered alongside him in the days that followed. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last organized resistance in Stalingrad collapsed entirely, and the roughly 91,000 surviving soldiers of what had once been a 250,000-man army laid down their weapons. What happened to Friedrich Paulus over the following decade is a story that most accounts of Stalingrad never reach, because they end the narrative at the surrender itself. But the surrender was, in a real sense, only the midpoint of Paulus's story, and the second half is arguably more historically consequential than the battle that preceded it. Paulus was transported into Soviet captivity along with the remnants of his army, and the conditions awaiting German prisoners at Stalingrad were catastrophic almost beyond comprehension. Mortality rates among captured enlisted soldiers are estimated by historians at over 90%, the result of disease, starvation, and exposure during forced marches and in overcrowded camps that had neither the infrastructure nor the food supply to accommodate the sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of prisoners in the middle of a brutal Russian winter. Of the roughly 91,000 men who surrendered alongside Paulus, only a small fraction, historians place the number at somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000, would ever return to Germany alive. Paulus himself, as a senior officer and a valuable propaganda asset, received markedly different treatment from Soviet authorities than his enlisted men did. Better quarters, adequate rations, medical attention, a distinction that would later become a source of bitter controversy when Paulus, testifying at the Nuremberg Trials, was asked directly by a journalist about the conditions endured by the ordinary Stalingrad prisoners under his former command. Paulus's reported response, to tell the wives and mothers of Germany that their husbands and sons were being treated well, stands in a deeply uncomfortable relationship to the actual mortality data historians have since documented, and it remains one of the more morally ambiguous chapters of his post-war life. For roughly the first 18 months of his captivity, Paulus refused any meaningful cooperation with his Soviet captors, maintaining at least an outward posture of continued loyalty to Germany despite his private contempt for Hitler personally. The event that changed this was the failed assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20, 1944. The officer-led conspiracy commonly known as the July Plot, and specifically, the brutal purge of the German military that followed it. When Paulus learned that former colleagues and personal friends, including Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben and General Erich Hoepner, had been arrested, tortured, and executed by the Nazi regime for their involvement or suspected involvement in the plot, something shifted decisively in his position. Beginning in August 1944, Paulus agreed to make anti-Nazi radio broadcasts for Soviet propaganda operations, declaring publicly on Free Germany Radio that the war was lost for Germany and that the nation needed to renounce Hitler's leadership entirely. He joined the League of German Officers and subsequently the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization explicitly designed to encourage German soldiers still fighting on the Eastern Front to surrender rather than continue a war Paulus now publicly and repeatedly called unwinnable and criminal. This was an extraordinary reversal for a man who had spent his entire career as one of the German military's most reliably obedient officers. The planner of Barbarossa and the general who had refused to defy Hitler's no-retreat order at Stalingrad had become, within 18 months, an open collaborator with the enemy against his own former government, a transformation that historians attribute to a combination of genuine ideological disillusionment, personal grief over executed friends, and the practical reality of his situation as a Soviet prisoner with limited alternatives. Paulus's final and perhaps most historically significant act came at the Nuremberg Trials in 1946, where he appeared as a witness for the Soviet prosecution against his former Nazi colleagues. His testimony provided direct, high-ranking insider confirmation of German planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union and the broader machinery of Nazi military decision-making. Testimony that carried particular weight precisely because it came from a man who had been present in the rooms where these decisions were made, rather than from a lower-ranking officer with second-hand knowledge. Notably, even in this position of full cooperation with the prosecution, Paulus drew a specific and consistent line. While he admitted his own guilt regarding the planning and execution of the attack on the Soviet Union, he consistently refused to provide testimony that would incriminate certain fellow officers, including Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel, on more sweeping personal culpability, a distinction that suggests his cooperation, however extensive, retained some selective boundaries rather than becoming total. Paulus remained in Soviet captivity until 1953, a full decade after his surrender, and notably 2 years before the general repatriation of remaining German prisoners of war, a delay that reflects both his particular value to Soviet authorities and the complexity of his political position. Upon his release, Paulus was permitted to settle not in West Germany, but in the German Democratic Republic, Communist East Germany, where he was appointed civilian chief of the Military History Research Institute, effectively continuing in a different form the propaganda role he had adopted as a prisoner. He lived out his remaining years in a villa in Dresden, suffering from declining health including cerebral sclerosis, and died on February 1, 1957, at the age of 66, almost exactly 14 years after the day Hitler had handed him a field marshal's baton and expected, in return, his death. Friedrich Paulus's story resists the simple categories that most narratives of Nazi Germany prefer. He was not a resistance hero. He had, after all, helped plan the very invasion whose catastrophic failure defined the rest of his life, and his transformation into a critic of the regime came only after his own capture and only accelerated after the personal loss of executed friends. Hardly the profile of principled dissent formed in advance of personal consequence. But he was also not simply another obedient instrument of Nazi military ambition, having ultimately defied Hitler's most direct and personal expectation of him at the one moment when defiance carried the most weight. The choice between a scripted, honor-preserving death and the harder, more complicated path of survival, cooperation with a former enemy, and eventual public testimony against the system that had made his career. What makes Paulus's story genuinely significant, rather than merely tragic, is the specific mechanism Hitler attempted to use against him: the deliberate weaponization of military honor culture, dressed as a promotion, designed to extract a death that would preserve a symbolic record rather than save an actual human life. Paulus's refusal to play that role, whatever mixture of self-preservation, religious conviction, and quiet contempt actually motivated it, represents one of the few moments in the entire war when a senior Nazi military official looked directly at what the regime was asking of him and simply declined.